Good afternoon, Grace family. Excellent to be here with you reading Ecclesiastes chapter 4. We'll be going into 4. It's a little bit shorter of a section today, so a little bit longer yesterday, so we'll try to make up for it today, I guess. So let's go ahead and get right into the text. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, starting verse 1. Again, I saw all of the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was none to comfort them. And I thought that the dead, who were already dead, more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been, and has not yet seen evil deeds that are done under the sun. Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envying of his neighbor. This is also a vanity and a striving after the wind. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands of toil and a striving after the wind. Again I saw vanity under the sun, one person who had no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end of all of his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches. So he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This is also vanity and an unhappy business. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, and has not another to lift him up. Again, if 2 lie together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. Better was a poor man and a wise youth than an old and foolish king, who no longer knew how to take advice. For he went from the prison to the throne through his own kingdom, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. I saw all the living who moved out under the sun along with that youth, who was able to stand in the king's place. There was no end of all people, all of whom he led. Yet those who came later will not rejoice in him. Surely this is also a vanity and a striving after the wind. So we've got some interesting kind of back and forth here with Qoheleth, the preacher. Again, there's some indication here that specifically in chapter 4, sorry for the Greek word showing up, that the preacher is not Solomon. Now, there seems to be this 2 voices, the things that the preacher has said and the person who continually says I. So there's the words of the preacher, which is obviously the person who's recording the writing, and then I saw. And so there's almost the sense that the writer and the preacher are 2 different people, and the writer then takes the form of the person of the preacher and what he's trying to say. And so that's kind of a little bit of why we talk about maybe Solomon isn't the writer. Also, there's other indications, one of them being here. In verse 1, he says, And I saw all of the oppressions that are done under the sun. Behold, the tears of the oppressed. They had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was none to comfort them. Now, the preacher in this context feels powerless to help those who are being oppressed. This doesn't give us the indication of someone who's actually king over Israel, unless the people that are being oppressed are not the Israelites. Furthermore, King Solomon was a profitable king who did many things well, but he did work the people very hard and certainly couldn't be described as someone who was concerned about the oppressed. Rehoboam, once he was made king in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 4, that had the people appeal to him. You'll see it in verse 4, or actually verse 3. We'll start back up in verse 3. And it says, And he sent and called him Jeroboam, and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you. And so Rehoboam ultimately is told you need to, reduce this kind of heavy workload, this oppressive burden that your father has placed upon us, and all the work that we were doing. And of course, if you know the story, Rehoboam basically makes a joke that his father's pinky wasn't nearly as heavy-handed as he was going to be. And so his whole pinky was heavier than his father's whole hand. And so that's kind of which ultimately causes some issues in Israel. But, kind of giving the idea here is that, Solomon wasn't necessarily someone who had been looking for this. Now, at modern day, current conversations, the discussion between power structures, power dynamics, oppressors, and oppression. This is a very much in the current conversation in our society today. And some of it has to do with Marxism, which Marx has a very interesting view of power dynamics and how economy kind of organizes everything in society. Very different from some other philosophers of the time. But what is true, and what is noticed by Koheleth as well, is that there is this oppression that happens of people. Now, that can be for a variety of reasons, some economic, some social, some political. And ultimately, that those people who are oppressed, if they don't have the power, and to a certain extent, there is this power dynamic that does exist, and we see this across societies and culture. And so the difference being is that the scripture says ultimately these things happen. We should aim to correct them, certainly, do justice, do right to those who are being oppressed. At the same time, God will judge and will know the thoughts and the intents of the heart. Sometimes we can't judge rightly in those things. We go in from there, verse 2 and 3. The preacher makes some pretty harsh statements. He says it's better off to be dead because they're more fortunate than living who are still alive. That's a pretty harsh statement, but bears out. In fact, even says in verse 3, he actually makes a comment similar to Job does, in that even those who don't exist have it better than those who do, because they haven't seen the evil things that are done on the earth. And so there's this sense of which the evil is all around us, and it's hard sometimes to witness evil and see horrible things happen, both to us and to people around us, and that kind of oppression, that difficulty that people experience, in some ways makes the preacher say it would have been better off to never exist in the first place. Verse 4 then kind of goes into this idea of looking at the toil and of man. And the preacher's already talked about how hard work and working really hard, to pursue that as the meaning of life is completely worthless. It's a pursuit of nothing but the wind. And that the meaning of life isn't found in work. But now he's addressing the purpose of toil in order to keep up with your envy. And he says, so then I saw all the toil and all the skill and work that came from a man's envy of his neighbor. And he says this is also a vanity. This is a striving after the wind. That being envious of what somebody else has ultimately is ultimately going to pursue nothing, meaningless. It's going to bring about meaninglessness. Proverbs chapter 14 verse 30 says this, a tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot. Ultimately, it's just going to be a constant striving after the wind. You're always going to be finding somebody who has something you don't have that you then desire. And it's going to be constantly pursuing the wind, which you'll never catch. Verse 5 then conversely says, well, then maybe the other side of the coin is the fool who folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Conversely, the fool doesn't work. His end is to eat his own flesh. And this could mean that he has nothing to eat except for himself, because he hasn't worked for anything, or that he sustains himself off of his relatives and off of his family. Either way, a man who doesn't work is beyond someone seeking something that can't even be grasped. He's a fool. And so this brings us to ultimately to what we see in verse 6, which is kind of a conclusion of this particular section. And he says, better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and striving after the wind. Conversely to the fool, even, we have as a person who's quiet, who does what is needed, has what he needs to sustain himself and his family, but not someone who's striving full, both hands all in after the wind, because their end is the same as we saw in chapter 3. The one who strove for nothing but gained just what he needed, versus the one who strove for everything, got whatever he could get, but both of those ends are meaningless. So, serious lesson in this for us today is that we need to not pursue earthly wealth as an end. If you think that going out there and putting in a 14-hour workday every single day is ultimately going to produce something of value in terms of financial to you, like, oh, I'll work at this job and I'll work this job and I'll acquire wealth for myself, you will never acquire enough. And for all the labor that you endure, you will never have anything or enough to show for it. As you look back at your life, as you get older, you look back and you say, all of that striving was for what? Instead, similar to what we saw in chapter 3 and chapter 2, work for what you need. Focus on what's important and enjoy what God gives you from the fruit of your labor. That's an important note there. Then we see in verse 7 and 8, we see a miserly man who's alone, someone who's pursuing after wealth because he has no son, he has no brother, he has nothing, no family, no one in his life, no friends. His eyes are never satisfied with riches. And so he never asks, for who am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? He works hard every single day. He makes lots of money, but to what end? To what end? Why is he depriving himself of pleasure? He's working really hard, ultimately to no value, to no end. And so Kohelet says, don't be like the miserly old, lonely man. Instead, he contrasts in verse 9, two are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil. What is the reward? Companionship, each other. And he even goes as far to say, for if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. There's this element that companionship ultimately produces a value in and of itself because you have someone to lean on. And you will fall, whereas the lonely miser, he has no one to back him up. And that's what he says specifically in verse 10. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. So then verse 11, he kind of doubles down on this idea. Again, if two lie together, they can keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Now, this isn't sexual in nature. This isn't talking about anything related to that. It's just conceptually, like two people are better than one. And, survival situations where you're cold and you're left in the elements, two people is better than one because your body heat together can keep you together and alive. And so there's this element that Kohelet is using that kind of analogy to say two people are better than one. If one falls, the other one can lift him up. If you're both out in the elements experiencing cold, together you can keep warm, whereas alone you would die. And then he uses the last analogy for this, and he says, if you get into a fight, and one man's fighting against another one, one man might be able to overtake him. You might be able to be overtaken by someone who's alone, but one against two, odds are the two are going to withstand the one, even if the one is more powerful. And he says a three-folded cord is not quickly broken. He then goes and argues yet again, three is even more powerful. Now, many have used the threefold cord as an analogy for tons of things. They've used it for the Trinity. They've used it for marriage, saying that your marriage has to have God and your wife and your spouse and your husband. Those kind of things aren't being stated directly here. Those might be applications of, but what's being stated here is that when three are together, that's hard to withstand those three. And so that's kind of the idea. Then we get into verse 13 and 16, and we see political intrigue and power is meaningless. That's kind of what we get, kind of the idea here. Now, there's been a lot of ink spilled. I've read a lot of different commentaries on specifically verses 13 and 14, talking about who is this wise youth, who is the old foolish king, and who is the he. And so it's very tricky to be able to determine this passage. Let me explain what I mean. So verse 13 says, better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. So we have two different individuals in picture here. We have a poor, and that's financially poor, but wise, a person of youth. And then we have contrast, a foolish king who did not know how to take advice. So we have two different people. And he says, better is this poor and wise youth than this foolish king who doesn't take advice. Why? Then verse 14, for he went from prison to the throne. Now, the problem is we don't know the pronoun he. Who is he referring to? Is he referring to the king, or is he referring to the youth? And that's what we don't know. So based upon your interpretation of that pronoun, of whether he is referring to the youth or he is referring to the king, kind of tells you a little bit more about how you're going to interpret this scenario. But either way, this individual, whichever individual, went from the prison, went to the throne. And Though in his own kingdom he had been born poor, whether that was the poor youth or the poor king originally, he saw all living who moved under the sun, along with that youth who was to stand in the king's palace. Basically, everyone's together, and whether it's the youth or the old king, there was no end of all the people to whom he led. So this individual leads everyone. He was first in prison, but then he ascended to the throne, even though he had been born poor. Everyone under the sun worshipped and was bound to this particular king, yet those who come later will not rejoice in him because they won't know him, and he won't order them around because he won't be around anymore. And this goes back to what we saw some of Ecclesiastes chapter 3, that the end of all men is death. And so if death is the end, then everything is meaningless because people will forget who you are. Your life will end and people won't know your name. And so even if you ascend to the highest place of king and you have all people in authority under you, people who come later, they're not going to rejoice about you. And so because of that, even political intrigue and power, it's a vanity. It's a striving after the wind. It's hebel is the Hebrew word, which we talked about before. The Hebrew word hebel, it really kind of gives this idea of enigmatic, something that's not able to be grasped or able to be controlled. And so you chase after it, but you never can really grasp it. You can never really hold on to it. You can never really acquire it. And you just always feel like it's just a little bit further away. And so that's specifically what he says regarding power and prestige. So we start with those who are oppressed, those who are miserable because the power is not theirs, and it would be better for them to be dead because of the horrible experiences they experience. And then we end with those who have that political power and prestige, but their end is death, and ultimately all of that power and prestige did nothing. It was just a vanity and striving after the wind. And that is what we see in Ecclesiastes chapter 4. God bless you all. Hope you enjoyed reading that with me, and look forward to doing Ecclesiastes chapter 5 tomorrow, where we start seeing a little bit of a transition of what Koheleth, the preacher, is actually telling people, given all of these meaninglessness, what should we do? And that's where he begins his discussion there. So, God bless you all. Have a great Tuesday. Look forward to doing this with you again tomorrow.